Hello, and welcome to Building Sustainability Podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Hart, aka Jeffrey the Natural Builder. Building Sustainability consists of conversations with designers, builders, makers, dreamers, and doers, exploring the wide world of sustainability in the built environment by talking to wonderful people who are doing excellent things. Hello and welcome. This is episode 35. In this episode, I'm talking to Kiran Pereira about the issues around the extraction of sand. Before I give Kiran the full intro, I just wanted to say, if this is your first Building Sustainability, then welcome. Thanks for joining us. If sustainability in the built environment is your interest, then take a look around the previous episodes. I think you will find some things you like. And for those who heard the last episode with Kit Jones, one of the earth building trainees, we talked about a guy called Saurabh who gave a presentation at last year's Clayfest. Earth Building UK and Ireland have just uploaded that talk to their YouTube channel, so I will chuck a link in the show notes. And one final thing before I properly introduce Kiran, I'm looking for sponsors for this podcast. So if you or someone you know is a good, sustainable business, then get in touch. Okay, enough of my blabber. So, Kiran promotes the topic of sand sustainability through her website, sandstories.org. And, as of tomorrow, has just published a book called Sand Stories, Surprising Truths About the Global Sand Crisis and the Quest for Sustainable Solutions. The little blurb about the book says, in Sand Stories, Kiran Pereira examines why sand is the most consumed commodity on the planet after water, as well as the impacts of this seemingly insatiable demand for sand. So we talk about methods of extraction and the issues that come from them. I was definitely encouraged by Kiran's optimism in the face of an issue so very large. And in fact, this conversation starts with me explaining why sand sustainability was an issue too far when I discovered it and that I couldn't get my head around it. I should say as well that I only noticed when I listened back to this, but I think Kiran calls me an architect. I'm not. I am just a lowly builder and very happy at that too. Good. Enjoy the episode and I'll be back at the end. My introduction to the idea that there was a sustainability issue with sand came a few years ago, and I was in the middle of building a big eco home, and to be given this knowledge that actually there was issues in sustainability for sand was too much to take on. I felt like I was doing everything I could to make this super insulated building using local natural materials. And then suddenly it's like, oh no, sand is now the thing. And I just couldn't deal with it. It was one step too far.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, imagine you're an architect and you feel this way. Just imagine a general person on the street, it's just like palm oil and food and, it's just too much for most people, I think. And that's why, that's possibly one of the reasons why you've not seen as much traction on this thing, because there's just one too many resources that are, called into question, kind of a thing. But there are solutions, and that's what I'd like to drive home. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, let's first of all talk about the sand uses, because I think certainly in my industry, we all know it as the basis of concrete or lime or earth. But it's not just used for that, is it?
No. So there are the top three uses are we extract minerals from sand that go into everything you see around you. So minerals that go into paints and plastics and paper and toothpaste and so stuff like that. We extract. It's also used for energy generation methods. If you think about methods like fracking, for example, many people know that fracking uses massive volumes of water, but what they might not know is that it also requires tremendous amounts of sand. So a normal fracking well today uses about 50 to 70 rail cars of sand for one well. Okay.
And in how long?
So the fracking process lasts about I don't know, 35, 40 days. It might go up to 60 days. But we're talking about a resource that has taken 500 million years to form. That kind of puts it in perspective. We're talking about raising hills to the ground and feeding that as a propellant into. So we're using basically one non-renewable resource to get at another non-renewable resource. And I don't know how we think this can be sustainable. So that just, I stop and think, and it amuses me sometimes. It's just, So fracking is one method that we use sand. We also require, if we talk about renewable energy and climate action, all the good things, for example, solar panels largely are made of silicon, and that comes from quartz. So again, we're talking about crushing quartz stone, or sandstone or quartz, or things like that are non-renewable to produce this. So it's very important. I think, unlike nature's way of working, which recycles things quite seamlessly, you never find waste, so to say. Waste is always reused and repurposed and transformed into something beautiful. I think humans and our way of working is very siloed. We use stuff and we end up producing. It's a very linear economy. So we produce tremendous amount of waste, and we're not thinking about end of life at the start, at the design stage. So we end up using so many chemicals or so many toxic material that's really not conducive to ensuring a circular economy. So
I'm still a little bit blown away by the fracking that revelation. And you said that it takes how many million years to create sand?
So sand is predominantly formed by weathering. So this is a process where temperature or rain or wind, pressure, factors like these kind of act on the rock and break it down into gravel, and then gravel breaks down further into. So it takes thousands of years to form one grain of sand, and sometimes even millions of years to form that grain of sand. And it's a cycle. So sand can then get compressed to form rocks, and but this happens over geological timescales, where it's definitely far beyond human timescales. So while it does get recycled and repurposed, essentially we're saying that sand is a non-renewable resource, because the amount of sand that we use today will not be replenished in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes, for that matter. So we really have to use it very, very carefully.
Is there a sort of an idea of how quickly we'll run out of sand? Is it a thing that we're going to run out of?
So the way to look at it is that we are running out of easily available deposits. And this is because not all kinds of, for example, desert sand is not suitable because it's too rounded and smooth, doesn't offer structural integrity for concrete and that sort of thing. There are ways to use it, but it's not generally used, on a large scale. So because the natural availability of the right types of sand is so limited and is so variable, we're running out of what's easily available. Now, governments can always offer more mining concessions, but the environmental, social, economic, geopolitical costs of the sand are increasing quite steeply, as I hope to demonstrate in the book. Yeah.
You've said that desert sand is not usable for say concrete. But where are we getting sand from that is usable?
So I don't know if you watched Sand Wars, the documentary.
I have. Yes.
You have, okay. So that was even though I did my master's on this particular topic, and I studied at King's College. I came here I grew up in Bangalore in India, and where I witnessed the kind of destruction and devastation caused by indiscriminate sand mining. And I came here to do a master's, and this was the topic of my studies. Basically, this is what I focused on. And despite being in the field, that documentary it caught me by surprise. There were so many things that were like, what? Is that true? So it was really fascinating to learn that Dubai was importing sand all the way from Australia.
That was crazy.
It was, wasn't it? And now there have been reports that Singapore is doing the same, is now importing sand from Australia, because Australia has the ability to provide sand that has been sourced responsibly, so to say.
Where are they getting their sand from? Is it?
When you say they, who do you mean?
Sorry, Australians.
Oh no, they're getting it from land-based quarries.
Okay.
Yeah, and then supplying it to Singapore.
Okay. Well, I guess looking at it in a larger sense, so we can get it from land-based quarries. We can get it from the sea.
Yes. So what happens is, sand is often mined from land-based quarries. It's mined from the bottom of the sea. It's mined from riverbeds, riverbanks, but the demand is so fierce that it's causing many farmers to kind of mine sand.
Okay.
Because farming is such a, in a sense, unreliable, particularly with climate change and, things like that. This is at least a way they find to feed their families. So in a sense, you find that it's a threat to food security as well in many regions because of the scale. It's just it's beyond any other resource that you can think about.
Sure, yeah. I wanted to sort of talk a little bit more about the extraction, or where it's coming from and what that's sort of doing to the places. So we've got rivers, seabeds, and land extraction. Mm-hmm. Should we go through and talk about? Let's start with say rivers. What does heavy extraction of sand do to a river?
It does tremendous amount of damage, because rivers are living systems, unlike land-based quarries. So most of these deposits that we are using have been laid down by glaciers in previous ice ages. That's why you find concentrated resources, that are available for use. When you talk about rivers, we tend to look at it, industries tend to look at it like it's just doing nothing out there, but that's not true. It is critical habitat. That's where the fish spawn and feed, and so when we remove sand, we are essentially removing habitat, for all bottom-dwelling creatures, for all larger fish that feed on these bottom-dwelling creatures, and things like that. So sand also allows water to percolate into the groundwater table. So you find in places like India, Sri Lanka, many even countries in Africa, the groundwater table has started falling simply because of this removal of sand. It causes rivers, it erodes the river bank, channels become unstable. So then you find that the rivers start flowing faster. They kind of erode the banks. They can cause flooding in neighboring locations, things like that. That can be quite damaging. It can affect agriculture along riverbanks. It can affect fisheries, because when you extract sand, it kind of muddies the water. So it kind of chokes the gills of fish and other organisms there. Species that are mobile tend to move away, but they still lose access to food sources and to spawning areas, things that they had before that they no longer have now. So that kind of impact is also seen when you talk about, so many developing economies tend to rely on sand dredged up from riverbeds, and because nature has done the work for us already in terms of giving us the right shape and size of the sand grains and things. But developed economies, particularly the UK and several other, we tend to depend on sand that has been dredged up from the bottom of the ocean. That it's done in a legal manner, licensed areas, all of that. The dredgers are fitted with black boxes at all times. But there are still problems even with that. So you find that fisheries are very concerned about what's happening to their fish stocks, because of this. They are forced into tighter and tighter areas where they have to fish. And so there's increasing competition in a smaller amount of space, kind of a thing, so it affects them and their livelihood as well. Dredging is, to put in very simplistic terms, it's a kind of, imagine using a vacuum cleaner to kind of hoover up all the sand that's there, that's pretty much what a dredger does. So it kind of vacuums up everything that's there in that particular spot. And if the client demands, I don't know, gravel, then they kind of release the smaller size particles, sand, and keep the gravel aboard and ship it to the nearest location. Or if the client's specification is for sand, then they kind of release gravel. So there's this kind of separation that happens on board. But this kind of process can again cause a lot of turbidity in the water. It can affect corals, for example. It can smother them. So then it cuts off life-giving sunlight. So and that's a problem for life beneath water. In the UK alone, since 1955, we have extracted over 500 million tons of sand and gravel. That's a lot,
Yeah.
It's a lot. And if you think about this resource is not going to be replenished, can we continue in this trajectory is a question that we all need to ask ourselves.
Yeah.
What kind of world are we going to leave behind for future generations if we continue along the same path? Yes, it's done legally, but it's still a resource that will not be replenished.
Yeah.
So how do we strike a balance? How do we? Yeah, so that's the kind of question that I'd like to raise.
Excellent. And the one of the striking images I saw in the Sand Wars documentary was the images of these dredgers. I mean, they're huge. I mean, I can't really describe the scale of them. They're enormous, and just how much sand, but also must be life and diversity that they're just sort of indiscriminately sucking up. It was like something from a sort of dystopian, horrible future the world faces, but it's actually happening now.
Yeah, I think the justification we seem to see is that it's for the economy. People need houses and people need homes and that sort of thing. But there's a fundamental assumption there that people can't build houses without sand, and that's not necessarily true. You do find examples where people are exploring other options. You find timber now that's growing in popularity. You find people using straw bale homes, which are a fantastic example. They can help us meet our climate ambitions. It's a co-product, so it doesn't require any more space to grow, to set aside area that was meant for growing food. It's a product that's usually wasted. So, there's so many examples. We just need to think creatively. I think humans are incredibly creative and we can come up with solutions. It calls for political will, it calls for collaboration. And I think it's possible.
Yes, it's very difficult. I'm sure the people doing the dredging and probably every step down the line are making probably a sizable amount of money. And why would they want to change?
That's $1 million question. Yeah, I think it also kind of feeds into the economy. So, export of these resources is also a key economic focus of the government. So I think there's a great need to really look at governance structures and examine who's benefiting and how and at what cost.
Yeah. So we'll come back to that. But who owns the seabed?
So the Crown Estate does.
Okay. So the Crown Estate is what, licensing parts of the seabed?
Yes. And it is. I do want to stress that it's done legally and it's done, with tremendous. So there are pre-dredge surveys that happen and post-dredge surveys that are also meant to happen. I think the bone of contention for many community organizations is that the project promoter, who's a dredging company, they are responsible for not only reporting the problem, but also finding solutions. They are responsible for sourcing, finding, commissioning, paying for the environmental impact assessments. So is it really neutral? Is it really, something that we can depend on? Is a question that many community organizations are asking.
Mm-hmm.
And many regulatory agencies now work on a project approach, so they cannot undertake any activity unless somebody agrees to pay for it first, either industry or government. And that kind of puts them in a very tight position, if you will. So you definitely need to look deeper into this.
Yeah. So it's my understanding. Well, you've said in the UK we've been dredging from the seabed. Is
not
that...
all? There are land-based quarries as well.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. We were going to talk about land-based quarries. So that's how does that work in terms of how is the sand extracted
in the UK?
Yeah.
So there are sites of there are specific allocated sites, and there are different regulatory agencies that look at whether this falls under protected area, things like that, and quarries are given specific number of years and stuff like that, and I imagine they are enforced as well. So,
mm-hmm. And then, I mean, in terms of just the sort of physical act of that, are they quarrying rocks and then breaking them down?
As well. It's not an either or. So
yeah.
All this thing, rocks are crushed to get aggregate of the required size. You do find sand being quarried. You do find gravel being extracted from.
Okay. And it seems like that would be a less destructive way of getting sand than, say, a riverbed, or in terms of wildlife, sort of in the way that water moves and things like that.
Yes, so rivers are they're living systems. So when you tamper with something, you can't predict what else will change. So it's definitely safer to get it from land-based quarries, but of course these need to be carefully controlled. In the UK and many other parts, these are mostly very controlled spaces. But in places like India, for example, quarries do spring up, in protected reserves or unregulated zones. So you can't use a blanket statement that says extracting sand from land is better, because there are all these, the context is critical.
Yes, absolutely. So you spoke a little bit about the sort of unregulated extraction that's going on in India. Yeah, what's happening there?
Sand is the new gold.
Right.
So sand is, it's such a critical resource for concrete, and concrete has become the kind of people aspire to concrete buildings, So it's because sand is such a necessary part of concrete, sand and gravel, 60 to 70% or 75% of concrete by volume. So it's even glass, for example, flat glass requires, any batch composition of glass is about 70% silica sand. So it's such a necessary component that you find, and yet at the same time, everyday conversations rarely talk about sand. The only time we talk about sand is when we want to go on a holiday, we're planning a beach, holiday, that sort of thing. So it's this kind of, I don't know, it seems to fall in our blind spot somehow. And so it's been quite easy. There's a sand mafia. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's quite shocking that you find people getting killed and threatened, intimidated, really horrifying things. And the cause is sand.
Yeah.
That's really it's kind of, it's hard. It's, if you're looking for a topic where fact is stranger than fiction, I think this is it.
Yes. So I was reading on your website that sand is the third biggest global crime. Is that right?
Yes, that's what this organization in Brazil has found out. There's much more research needed on this particular topic. Yeah. I imagine going forward we'll get to see more.
Yeah, I mean it seems crazy. I mean, how's that sort of playing out in places like India?
So I've been attending something called the India Rivers Week. They had 4 regional dialogues where you had policymakers, you had lawyers, you have activists, you have river experts, kind of coming together and for a panel discussion. And it's been so fascinating to hear. Although I grew up in India and I'm now based in London, I think I hadn't realized it was so bad. It really sounds, it's quite incredible that we kind of still don't know how much sand is being extracted from all these places. And there's a mafia in many places. And sometimes in other places, we call them the mafia, but they're really people who live in that region. They're really the locals who, for want of a better livelihood or for want of a better way of feeding their families, they have no option but to kind of mine sand. And so I think we need to think about how we can provide employment and a livelihood for thousands and millions of people without, damaging the environment.
Yes, there was a fascinating story on your the crowdfunder for your book. You gave us a sample section of text, and there was a story about fishermen who are no longer fishing for fish but fishing for sand.
Yeah, that was heartbreaking for me. It was part of it was when I traveled. So when I did my master's. To be honest, after completion, I was so distressed because when I traveled to Mumbai or the villages around Mumbai and I saw what was happening to these fisher folk, they've been fisher for generations. I mean, their fathers, grandfathers, that sort of thing. They know their river like the back of their hand. But the river is changing so rapidly with all this sand extraction that's happening that the only source of employment, the only livelihood that they have is now their indigenous knowledge is becoming obsolete. It's no longer serving them. So yeah, it was really quite distressing for me until I decided to shake myself, and kind of write a blog and see what happens.
Yeah.
And that's how it brought me into contact with Dennis Delestrak, who was making sandbars, and he invited me to be interviewed for sandbars, and I've never looked back ever since. So it's been, it's been an interesting journey. I'm learning so much each day. It's just incredible. This topic it branches out and touches so many aspects of our life. I don't think I'd ever get bored of sand.
That's funny. I think a lot of people would think it's a very simple thing to understand.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's not. Yeah. It's anything but.
So yeah, I'm interested. Let's sort of delve into let's talk about people's lives. So we spoke briefly there about the fishermen who are now fishing for sand instead of fish. What other ways is it affecting people?
If you look at the global sustainable development goals, sand mining intersects with every single one of those. If you talk about, for example, in Uganda and Kenya, you have children who are dropping out of school in order to mine sand, because sand mining pays more than traditional farming does. And reward is immediate, unlike education, where you go to school for 10 years, you may or may not get a job, who knows, that sort of thing. So the temptation to stay out of school is very real. If you talk about no poverty, or I'm looking up here because I have the Sustainable Development Goals right here, no poverty or zero hunger, you find people whose livelihood is being decimated, so they have no option but to mine sand, and that kind of further endangers their. There's forced migration, because if you talk about, if they have no other way of feeding themselves, what do? They're forced to kind of migrate to cities, and then cities become overcrowded, and the facilities are, so it's a vicious cycle.
So these are people that have lost their livelihoods due to sand being extracted. Then
yes,
the only way to survive is to then extract sand themselves.
Yes,
oh,
and
awful.
And yes, yeah, it is. It really is. And in some places, like in India, for example, let's talk about that. These fishermen belong to the lower castes, and so whereas the dredgers and the barges are owned by elites, and so the police are very, very reluctant to kind of lodge FIRs and complaints and things like that. But without a registered police complaint, these people cannot get bank loans to repair their nets, or repair the broken boats or things like that. So it drives them deeper into poverty. They're forced to go to money lenders to kind of make ends meet, and then that causes a whole spiral of indebtedness for generations. They are locked into this vicious cycle. So yeah, really, policymakers need to take all this into account, because it's not reflected in the cost of sand at all.
We've talked a little bit sort of social and economic. What's happening sort of in terms of, well, I've seen sea erosion and sort of big dramatic images of coastal towns kind of falling into the sea. What's happening there?
So I think we need more studies to conclusively say what's happening there, because it's although there have been some studies that have been they haven't been followed up, so there's definitely more evidence needed, and I imagine going forward we'll definitely find more scientists doing precise studies and giving us more information.
So are you saying that it's not entirely sort of proven that all the extraction of sand from, say, the sea is causing faster coastal erosion?
So if you saw in Sand Wars, it shows you how when you dredge from it kind of sand moves in to fill that space, that vacuum. So yes, it does cause, but the extent and how much it is contributing to erosion is not something that I can say. This is, I think, something that requires further study, and I imagine. I also imagine it depends on location, the kind of sand, kind of aggregate that's being extracted from that particular place. So I imagine we will find out more in the coming years.
Okay.
So the UNEP has released a report, a global report in 2019. I'm not sure if you saw, it's Sand and Sustainability, where they talk about how the scale of the problem is so huge that it's one of the biggest sustainability challenges of the 21st century. They also offer solutions in terms of look for alternate materials, reduce the use of sand, so over design, and if things like that need to be reduced. Yeah, so solutions like that I think are key.
Solutions, yes, that's sort of something I'd like to talk about, because it's it'll make my my anxiety go a little bit better if I can see some hope.
Oh, there's definitely hope. I think I'm not an architect, but I think I find it very comforting to know that there's so much action happening on the circular economy front. That people are exploring options of how we are extracting a tremendous amount of resources from our natural world. If there's a way that we can reuse that material, I think it would be a win-win for nature. It would be a win-win for us, and that really is the way forward.
What does the reuse look like? Is that sort of crushing down old buildings, or is that?
It's context specific, like I said. In places where infrastructure is already built up, I think the Architect Journal says the greenest building is the one that already the one that already exists. And I think I can get behind that 100%. It really is a way of finding a way to not tear down those buildings, but make them work. Kind of, see how we can make them work. But in cases where we do need to tear down buildings, on a global scale, over 1/3 of resources that are construction and demolition waste is recovered and reused, and the rest goes to landfill. I mean, under 1/3 of, so that's a huge amount of waste that we're talking about. And it comes at such a cost to the environment, and all this cost is externalized onto societies and onto the environment. I definitely think we should be looking at how we can reuse that material. So yes, crushing it down into its constituent components to see how that can be reused in concrete and other applications could be an important solution. And there are tremendous, there are examples that I've quoted in my book. There's this company called CDE Global, which makes machinery for recycling aggregate, construction and development aggregate. And they and their partners together, they have managed at the end of, as of today, for example, they have managed to divert about 80 million tons of construction and development waste that would have gone to landfill. I think that's the kind of change that we need to see at scale.
Yeah.
And there are definitely pockets of people working on solutions. What we need is to bring them together. And so that kind of can give us a much more cohesive solution.
Mm-hmm. Is there any alternative to sand? Is there a thing that could just be sort of substituted?
There are experiments going on in different parts of the world. Some people are trying to use plastic. I'm not sure that's necessarily a solution. Because in places where waste management, where plastic is really overtaking any waste management solutions, in those contexts, they feel that using plastic could be, could be a win-win. Debatable, but some people are trying that. Other people are trying to create aggregate with rubber tires.
It sounds like there's certainly those two options seem to me like they are maybe going to solve one problem and create many more.
Possibly, yes. That's why it's so important to look at the big picture before we decide on solutions.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
great. So, what can your regular builder do? Someone maybe doing up their own home, or like changes that we can make on a small scale. What could we do to help?
I think what's the missing piece to all of this is awareness, really. So it's critical that all builders, anybody who works with sand and gravel, knows that this is a precious resource. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be replenished in our lifetimes or future generations. So it's really, really important to treat it like that. Mm-hmm. And that means not just having these discussions, but also seeing if you can explicitly specify the use of recycled sand. That would be huge. When you see that there's demand, supply automatically finds a way to meet that demand. So create a demand for it. Really ask for recycled sand. Ask for alternate materials. You use timber, use straw, rammed earth. So many natural building techniques are so inspiring. They don't require you to go out of your way to do good.
Great. Well, what I probably should have asked you at the beginning, actually, it says on your website that you experienced the sort of troubles of sand extraction firsthand in India. What was your experience of that?
Some of my earliest memories have to do with going out to fetch water, to help my family to fetch water at the public tap. And we had to wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning to go. And there was always a queue, lots of people at the public tap, pushing, fighting. It was really something that left a deep impression on me. We moved houses and life became more normal, in air quotes, that sort of thing. I didn't think too much about it until the point when I decided to study further, and then kind of look back and realized what a formative experience this was, because removing sand and gravel from riverbeds really impacts the water table. It impacts, it can cause much more damage than we are aware of at the moment. That was one example. Also, when I was actually doing the field study for a master's dissertation, and I visited these places, there was a point when the local activist guide was taking us around. We had hired a taxi to go, and I write about this in the book. We had hired a taxi, and we were standing on a bridge all of 5 minutes, and the guide was pointing at illegal embankments that had been built into the river so that the barges could be unloaded onto trucks, and the sand could be shipped off to market easily, all illegally, of course. And within 5 minutes, you had a youth on a motorcycle, who was relaying a description of us, of my brother and I, and the driver, and the car license plate to somebody on the telephone. It was intimidating is wouldn't do it justice. It was like, wow, 5 minutes, that sort of thing. It really left a deep sense of unease. It's just, we're just talking about sand, and that can get somebody into trouble. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine the kind of how important a resource this is. So It's really, really critical to find alternatives, to use renewable resources.
There's another fascinating part of the chapter you've posted online, which was just sort of documenting. I think it was a contractor, and their sort of denial of sand being an issue, and their sort of view that it was to put up the prices, and it was all a sort of an economic scam, I guess. Mm. Is that a thing that you've run into a lot? That sort of
unfortunately, yes. I think the supply chain is so extended. We really don't. Architects really don't know where their sand and gravel is coming from. Neither do So it's just because there are so many players involved in the supply chain. It's hard to believe what you don't see. Mm. But it is the truth. It's just the scale is unlike any other resource.
Well, I think that's why your book and the work you're doing is so good, because it brings it into human levels and human interactions. That's really important for people to actually understand.
Oh, thank you so much.
That's quite
That's
all right.
Encouraging.
Yeah. Well, is there more? We've sort of given an overview of kind of what's going on in the sand world. Is there more that people should know about, or aspects that you think are really important to touch on?
I just reiterate that there are solutions. So it's important not to feel overwhelmed. It's important not to put our heads in the sand. It's important this problem is not going to get sorted or go away. It's something that we need to look at, face head on, and deal with it. We are incredibly creative. I think we have tremendous amount of engineering proficiency, I'm sure we can come up with solutions and find a way, find workarounds.
Thank you so much to Kiran for taking the time to speak with me. I know that she was very busy finalising details of her book, so to make the time was excellent. It's released tomorrow, so for the vast majority of people listening, it's already out. But for me, I'm just going to have to assume that all the details you need to get your hands on the book are available at sandstories.org. I personally will be doing the same myself. Can't wait. At the moment, actually, there's a free chapter available on her website, so do check that out. She's got a very enjoyable writing style. Okay, so before I go, just wanted to say a little more about my ask at the beginning of the episode for sponsors. There are topics and directions I'd like to take this podcast, and I think if I can get a couple of sponsors on board, it will enable me to take on some travels to meet more people doing excellent things. So I've got some ideas for podcast series within building sustainability. So for example, looking at craft and crafters in more detail. I'd love to get a boat across to the US and travel across the US meeting some of their excellent people. Yeah. And maybe if I got a sponsor that could sponsor multiple episodes, that little influx of cash could enable me to do that. Who knows? Maybe even the sponsor isn't the right way to do it. And maybe there's a grant. If anyone out there is a grant application whiz and knows of a pot of money that might be available to someone promoting sustainable causes, yeah, I'd love to hear from you if you can help in any way. Yeah, I'm really thoroughly enjoying making this podcast. Just needs a little bit of financial backing to make it a sustainable thing for me. But we'll see. As always, if you'd like to support directly, then you can head to patreon.com/building sustainability. And if you can't do that, because who has spare cash at this time of year, mid-pandemic, then please take a moment just to share this episode to anyone that might like it. Yeah, I think that's it. So thank you very much for listening right to the end. As a special gift, because I imagine most people switched off as soon as I started waffling, I just wanted you to know that right now I have a duvet over my head, and that's what enables this luxurious sound quality. There you go. That's our little secret. Don't tell all the others. Thank you, everybody. Till next time. See ya.